So, as you know, we've got both questions on the prep sheet, and both are going to be on the final exam. So I want to go through with these with you pretty slowly and record it so that when you start collecting the information for yourself, you'll know exactly what it is that I'm looking for. So, in the period 1820 to 1877, liberty expanded considerably in America, but also narrowed. Prove the first part of this statement with reference to the expansion of democracy, the rise of the Democratic Party, how liberty was defined by reformers, the abolitionists, women's rights advocates, the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the experience of Southern blacks during radical Reconstruction. So the point that I'm making there is in all of those items noted on the first part of that question, there was a distinct expansion of democracy, okay? And, an expansion of liberty, broadly defined, both in the thinking of people, policies put in place, and the actual consequences. So, when I'm talking about the expansion of democracy, I want you to look at your chapter 10 and see exactly, how did the vote expand? What was going on, specifically in chapter 10, that the vote considerably expanded, of course, only for white men, but it did considerably expand. What were the states doing to make it easier for them to vote? Again, with chapter 10, look at the Democratic Party. What was it about the Democratic Party that satisfied people's needs for more liberty, more freedom? What did the Democratic Party stand for? What was their beliefs? Who voted for them? The next part of the question gets a little tricky. I'm asking you to explain how is liberty defined by those three groups I mentioned: reformers, abolitionists, and women's rights advocates. Now, when I mean the reformers, I'm talking about the middle class reformers, all right? Those folks that built the public schools, the folks that tried to limit the hours that bars were open, those people, the people that tried to reform asylums and prisons. So how did they define liberty? Remember, during the market revolution, and you did this for the midterm, chapter 9, liberty is defined as individual self-fulfillment, which at that time meant do not interfere with the individual who is taking advantage of all the economic and political opportunities available, mostly to him. Do not put any obstacles in the individual trying to work hard and enjoy the fruits of his labor. The reformers had a different definition of how to achieve self-fulfillment, how to achieve real freedom. That's what I'm asking. The abolitionists. What was the abolitionist's definition of liberty? Now, don't just stop at, they believe that slavery should be abolished. Yes. But they were talking to a group of people that were schooled to believe that real freedom was individual self-fulfillment. And they took that original definition and they worked it to convince them that if you believe in this, then you must stand against slavery. So that's what I'm asking there. How did they define liberty? The same thing goes for the women's rights advocates. Yes, they were calling for all the things in the Declaration of Sentiments. The vote, access to higher education, etc., etc., etc. But they also, like the abolitionists and like the reformers, were speaking to an audience that were convinced that freedom meant being left alone. They built on that, and they argued real individual self-fulfillment comes from this. So how did they define liberty? And if this sounds a little unfamiliar, just go to your PowerPoints, go back, especially your PowerPoints, and go back to your lectures, your textbook. Okay, remember, your textbook is called Give Me Liberty. Hey, Lorenzo, close the door, please. Your textbook is called Give Me Liberty. The entire book is based on the expansion and contraction of liberty throughout American history. Each chapter is organized in that fashion. Then, once you've done all these things, move on to the Emancipation Proclamation. How did the Emancipation Proclamation show that there was a considerable expansion of liberty during this time? So, define what it is, when did it take place, what were the consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation. And remember, you can use not only your textbook, but the essay that you did for me, the Stephen Oates versus Vincent Harding essay, because that entire series of readings was about what did the Emancipation Proclamation actually mean. Let's see. All right. The experiences of Southern blacks during radical Reconstruction. This always confuses students, so I'm going to speak slowly and clearly so you know what you're looking for. Radical Reconstruction is that period after Congress takes over in 1867 and starts enforcing Southern black political and civil rights. This is all being recorded. After 1867, they take over Reconstruction policy. So, what kind of laws did Congress pass to protect Southern black civil and political rights? How did they enforce them? And, more importantly, how did Southern blacks' political and civil life change as a consequence of these laws and the protection of the Union Army that enforced these laws, starting in 1867 and going up to about 1874. That is the period of radical Reconstruction, where Southern blacks and the freedoms of Southern blacks exploded. Now, then focus on the second part of the statement, which is how did liberty contract for certain peoples during this time? So, Native Americans. I think that's chapter 10. Look at chapter 10. I think it's just chapter 10. What happened to Native Americans in the 1830s, 1840s? How were they treated by their government? How were their freedoms protected or not, as is the case? Go ahead.
Wasn't that the assignment that you gave us the day that you were absent? I think you talked about that in there.
No, that was chapter 13. But we did chapter 10 in class, and if I didn't get to that part, it's certainly in the PowerPoints, which are posted on Blackboard. And yes, they're definitely in the PowerPoints, but of course, everything is in your textbook. Okay? The Southern pro-slavery argument. I think this is chapter 11. The entire chapter is about slavery. I think. I'm not sure, but you'll find it. The Southern pro-slavery argument. How did it justify slavery? Okay? Now, it was more than just a racist belief that whites are superior. Of course, that's part of it, but they went further The Southern pro-slavery argument was meant to convince as many people as possible on some level that slavery was justified, and that it was justified to narrow liberty for slaves, to deny them liberty for slaves. How did they do it? How did they redefine liberty to make it okay to preserve slavery in a country technically devoted to the principle that all men are created equal, born free, etc., Declaration of Independence? And then finally, the experiences of Southern blacks at the end of Reconstruction. What I'm referring to there specifically is the period starting roughly 1874 and ending in 1877, where the enforcement and protection of civil and political rights in the South for blacks was abandoned, and whites took over their governments. What happened to Southern blacks at this time? What happened to their political involvement? How were they treated day to day? What type of laws were put in place that took away their civil and political rights? Go ahead. That's the what? The Jim Crow laws, yeah. But that's at the end, after 1876, 77. What happened between 74 and 77 that whites got back in power, who then passed the laws? Okay? Yes? All right. So that is question one. The first half is all about those folks who either had their liberties expanded or they tried to redefine the concept of liberty in order to expand it for their particular groups, or there was actual policies that allowed for freedoms to expand. Okay? So and then obviously the second part of question one are groups that actually had their freedoms curtailed in real life, or were justified in theory that they should be curtailed, like the pro-slavery argument. So any questions about number one? Remember, your answers come from everything from chapters 10 through chapter 15 of the Phoner book. And that's it.
Question one, right?
Question one. But question one and two, both of them take from chapters 10 through 15. Any questions about number one? Take your time. Look at your notes. Look at the screen. Take your time.
The experience of Southern blacks can be at the end of Reconstruction. That could be found in what chapter? 15?
15 is Reconstruction. That's all after the Civil War. The experience of Southern blacks after 1865 is all chapter 15. The Reformers, Abolitionists, Women's Rights Advocates, that's chapter 12, The Age of Reform. The Expansion of Democracy and the Democratic Party, both of those are chapter 10. Emancipation Proclamation is chapter 14. Deals with the Civil War. The Experiences of Southern Blacks during Radical Reconstruction, that's chapter 15. Native Americans, I think, is chapter 10. I think. Don't quote me. Just look through the chapters. I don't remember the Southern pro-slavery argument. I believe it's chapter 11. I'm not 100% sure. But just look in the index. You will find Southern pro-slavery argument, or just look through the PowerPoints. There's a section on it. And then again, Experiences of Southern Blacks at the end of Reconstruction, chapter 15. But I do suggest, if you haven't printed out the PowerPoints from chapter 10 through 15, you do. All of this stuff is noted there, and it'll point you to those chapters and the parts of those chapters that you should be focusing on for details. Any other question about question one? Questions about question one, excuse me? Go ahead.
No, the Native Americans is in the end of chapter 10.
Yep. Yes, the Southern pro-slavery argument is definitely chapter 11. So are we good on question 1? You know what I'm looking for? You know more or less where to find it? And think of the answer sheet that I gave you after the midterm. Think of detail to your answers. And also remember, answer the question that's being asked of you. Don't just give me a series of definitions. Just answer the question that I'm asking you. Okay? All right. Question 2. The lead up to the Civil War was a long process involving multiple compromises in Congress to regulate the expansion of slavery westward, and numerous events that were a direct response to these compromises that poisoned relations between the North and the South, and finally pushed them to war. So prove this statement with reference to, etc., etc., etc. Now, what am I asking for? I'm asking for you narrate exactly what it is, the history of North and South relations from the Missouri Compromise all the way up to the election of Abraham Lincoln. All right? And the goal here is to make sure that, let me see, the goal here is to make sure that you can adequately narrate that there was at the beginning, nobody wanted to discuss slavery, and thereafter, you couldn't avoid it. And so North and South tried to find a way to just split the difference, split the difference, split the difference, and eventually they ran out of space. They were divided into two opposing camps, North versus South, over this issue of slavery, and war was the only solution. All right? Now, let me see. Let me see. All right. What's that? Yeah. All right. All right. Just excuse me a moment. But in fact, I want to make sure that you all pass this class. Now then, you got to start off with the Missouri Compromise, right? Of 1820. First of all, you got to tell me, what is it? What was the Missouri Compromise? What did the North get? What did the South get? Were there any hard feelings because of the Missouri Compromise? Once you do that, you move on to the Compromise of 1850. Again, what was it? What did the North get? What did the South get? Who was left frustrated by the end result? Felt like they got cheated. Felt like they gave up too much in order to maintain the peace. When you move on to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, this is where things get pretty spicy. Because, again, what is the Kansas-Nebraska Act? And you want to make sure that you make clear that even though this was a law that attempted to find a compromise that made everybody happy, the end result was there was one group significantly upset at the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so you're showing how tension continues to rise between North and South at every one of these points, right? When you talk about the rise of the Republican Party, what I'm referring to is the Republican Party is a regionally specific party. It's only in one part of the country. What is it about the Republican Party that makes that part of the country completely back the Republican Party and turn their back on the Democratic Party? All right? What is it about the Republican Party that makes the North line up behind them and abandon much of the Democratic Party and certainly the Whig Party? Okay? And what you're doing here is you're showing that the very fact that the Republican Party emerges with only northern support is showing how the country is dividing more and more north versus south. So, why did the Republican Party emerge? What did they stand for? Who supported them? Why? Things like that. Okay? Now, Bleeding Kansas. Again, what is this referring to? And how do I put this? Bleeding Kansas was a result of the policies of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay? So what is Bleeding Kansas, and how did it reconfirm people's belief that the Republican Party, in fact, was the party to support? And the Republican Party was a northern-only party, further dividing the country. The Dred Scott case. Again, what is it? Define it. What was the conclusion to the Dred Scott case? The Supreme Court Dred Scott case. How did people respond to this case? How did it raise tensions between the Northerners and the Southerners? Because one side was happy with the case, the other side was incredibly upset. John Brown's raid. Again, what is it, right? Who is this guy John Brown? What did he attempt to do? Was he successful? Was he a failure? How did the North and the South look at John Brown differently? And how did it increase the tension between the regions? And finally, Lincoln's election of 1860. Who voted for Lincoln? What part of the country voted for Lincoln? What part did not vote for Lincoln? What did Lincoln's election represent in terms of how divided the country was? And what was the result of Lincoln's election? So, again, you're telling me a story. Starting with the Missouri Compromise, the North and the South were very committed to working out their differences over slavery. They agreed to disagree with compromise after compromise after compromise. But as the years went on, both sides became increasingly frustrated with the compromises, the negotiation. They felt like they were being cheated out of what was important to them. And eventually they just decided that war was the only answer because there was no reason left over to talk about it. There was no negotiation left over that could get over this basic difference over slavery. And all of these things here increased that tension until there was war. So take a look at question 2, take a look at your notes, and take a moment to think about what, if anything, is unclear. Question number 2 is You can get all this information in many ways from a little bit of chapter 10, mostly chapter 13. Yeah, a little bit of chapter 10 and mostly chapter 13. It's a dense question, but you're not pulling information from 5 chapters. I believe most of this information comes from chapter 10 and 15. So, again, if you haven't printed out the PowerPoints, do so. You'll get a lot of guidance from the PowerPoints, as well as the pre-recorded lectures. Now, some of those lectures I've come to realize do not work because the volume was not functioning. If I have the chance to re-record them privately, I will, but in the meantime, you at least have the PowerPoints that are up on Blackboard to refer to, as well as the textbook chapters. Are there any questions about question 2 or 1? And remember, both are going to be on the final exam. Both will be answered in essay format, and you will have 2.5 hours to answer these questions without the use of notes, books, any devices, etc., just like the midterm. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
So the Bleeding Kansas was basically the result of the Kansas and Nebraska Act.
Yeah, the Kansas-Nebraska Act said, okay, this is how we're going to solve this problem over slavery. And then Bleeding Kansas was the result of implementing that problem, which just convinced everybody that the Republicans were right in the first place. So define Bleeding Kansas, what is it, and how do people respond to it, north and south? Other questions about terms or what I'm asking or where the information is located or anything like that?
You said chapter 10 and 13, right?
That is my best guess where all these items are located. If I'm wrong, just look at your index of your textbook or the PowerPoints, which are, of course, based on the textbook. And, of course, you also have the lectures that are up on YouTube. Yes.
Can you repeat the questions that is about the Lincoln election?
When you talk about Lincoln's election, talk about, who voted for him, who did not vote for him, and what was the ultimate consequence of Lincoln getting elected. What happened after he got elected? That showed just how divided North and South really were. Other questions? Comments? So then let me offer you some suggestions about how to study. If you have not read any of those chapters, 10 through 14, and have been depending on the lectures, I would recommend that you take a look at those actual chapters in the textbook, because my lectures are meant to highlight main points. And the PowerPoints have a lot of detail in them, but it will benefit you to not only look at the PowerPoints, but then to scan through the chapters to get a second way of inputting that information. Okay? I also recommend that if any of these terms are simply unfamiliar to you, you just don't remember me mentioning them in class, the very first thing you have to do is define them. So go through your textbook and look up the abolitionists, look up the middle-class reformers, look up women's rights advocates, the Emancipation, look up all these things. I wouldn't, because I'm only grading you on information that I've shared with you via the textbook, and the internet is generally accurate for a lot of things.
Like specific things that you asked.
Well,
'Cause
if
I
you,
didn't forgot.
then you got lucky. Use that as your third resort, not your first or second. Stick with the textbook and the PowerPoints. Because if I say, yes, the internet's great, and then someone goes and looks up...
I did the PowerPoints, but the thing, like, I used my notes.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I was confused on, like, a part of it, then
Yeah.
I would just Google it, and it would give me more of a...
Yes, if you're doing it that way, that's great. If you go through your notes, the textbook, and the PowerPoint, and you just still haven't quite figured out what this thing is, when did it happen, then look it up on Google. But I want to be 100% clear. The only thing I can grade you on is the stuff coming out of your textbook and my lectures, both the PowerPoints and the recorded lectures. I'm not responsible for whatever quack has put anything on the internet. All right? Because, remember, the rumors on the internet, Lincoln had slaves, etc., etc. Stick with the textbook, stick with the lectures. Unless you're doing it, as was mentioned, you start off with your own notes, the PowerPoints, the textbook, and then you just want some extra help at the end. Anything else? So our exam is next Tuesday, right? Next Tuesday? As such, actually, I'm going to stop recording for people that will get confused. Our class, the 5:30 class, is next Tuesday. Everybody else is a different schedule.